Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast that cuts through the noise of the many policies and regulations that affect American agriculture. Each week, we pull back the curtain on the programs, policies, and perceptions shaping the agricultural community in rural America. If you've ever felt like something doesn't add up, you're not alone. I'm Jenny, and this is Smoke and Mirrors. Let's make sense of the maze we call farm policy. Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. I'm Jenny Ift. I teach agricultural policy at Kansas State University. I'm excited to have Ray Starling with me, who is an alum of the first Trump administration and works for the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce. Ray, thanks for joining. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jenny. It won't be hard to tell our accents apart or our voices apart. I'm a native North Carolinian, grew up on a farm here in the southeast part of the state, primarily a hog and tobacco farm. It's interesting because that farm now no longer grows either of those things, and that's kind of the nature of the business, right? You have to change and adapt and keep up with the times. I'm an NC State grad, went to UNC Chapel Hill to law school, so apologies to your listeners that are listening to an attorney. They're probably thinking, why did you have an attorney on the show? Who would want to listen to that? Am I going to get a bill for this? But I sort of consider my legal work different than most lawyers. I don't go to court. I occasionally help write amicus briefs for entities that are already in court here at the Chamber Legal Institute, where we care about the legal environment of the state and how predictable and certain it is for the business community. But probably the more notable part of my resume is that I did work in ag policy at kind of the highest levels of the federal government. I also did that in the state government. I teach an ag and food policy law course at UNC Chapel Hill, and I've written a book called Farmers versus Foodies that I suspect we'll touch on here in a few minutes, that really sort of looks at where we are in the context of the greater conversation around ag policy and the future of the industry in terms of outsiders versus insiders' views on that, which I think sets us up well for a conversation about MAHA.
Absolutely. And this is a part of a series of broader conversations I'm trying to understand public health issues, nutrition issues. I think because of the MAHA movement, we're having broader dialogue and debate about what we see as ag policy in public health. And I think of the MAHA movement, they care about diet, they care about exercise, they care about over-medication, they care about environmental chemicals. Is there anything else, Ray, when you think about this movement? I mean, the acronym's barely a year old. Those ideas have been around longer. How would you think about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're right to list all of those things, but I also think the lack of specificity is both part of its strength and arguably part of its weakness. When you're building coalitions, you want to have a big tent. I think MAHA gives off the emanation that it is a big tent, sort of like other phrases that Trump is sort of famous for saying. I mean, all politicians do this, try to make everyone think they're on the team. But again, that gives and takes. And so I think, unfortunately, everything you just listed and more probably falls under that heading, which makes it difficult to nail down what are the priorities, what are they actually up to here.
Right. And it's also, you have the MAGA coalition, the Trump administration, MAHA, and it seems like they're trying to figure out how to work together still.
Yeah, and if you would have told me, I mean, the fact that we didn't see it coming this way is precisely what makes it totally believable that it's come this way, right? If you'd have told me 10 years ago, there's going to be a coalitions of mothers who care deeply about health, even, farmers and rural folks who feel like something is missing in terms of the comprehensive health picture and health outcomes that they hope to achieve throughout their lifetimes, that the younger generation would obviously be interested in being more healthy than, say, maybe my generation. If you ask me, okay, what political party in America is going to quarterback that effort or actually make it mainstream or actually make it, really devote resources to it, I certainly would not have picked the Republican Party, and I would not have picked the Trump administration. And yet here we are, right? I mean, a gentleman who, frankly, and this is all factual, was literally a registered member of the other party a year ago, or maybe a little longer than a year ago now, is now our principal public health officer in the country. And so I think that that is sort of man bites dog, right? That's just one of many things that's different about this is typically on the right, it is a non-interventionist sort of view, right? I mean, conservatives as a group generally think, let the markets work. If we intervene here, we're not smart enough to know what that's actually going to mean down the road. So let's have some humility about what we can actually accomplish. That is not really the tack that MAHA seems to be taking. They seem to be very interested in market intervention and in changing some rules and setting some new standards. And so again, I think in sum there, this is not rolling out the way maybe we would have predicted. Even if we'd have predicted this is a reasonable or sensible movement to be occurring.
Right, right. And I would say my sort of gut assessment of it is there's a lot that's super broad based in the movement, and there's some that's gonna fall along much partisan lines. But that kind of gets into what I wanted to discuss with you is sort of how the MAHA movement sees governing. And you talked about, okay, they're more comfortable with government intervention than traditional conservatives, and then how this could play out in traditional agricultural policy. And again, this is happening in real time.
Yeah, no, I let me exaggerate on that just a little bit. I mean, I think you nailed it in terms of recapping my initial thoughts of the view of the group or the movement on government. And again, sort of antithetical to that notion that markets will eventually work. And even that is a hedge, right? Eventually work. I mean, even if you're kind of trained in the traditional economic study, you probably generally believe that markets will eventually work. But eventually is a mouthful, right? Like, how long will it take? And the American people are entitled, and I think the government and elected officials are entitled to move things along more quickly when they sense that's what their constituents want. I think in terms of the second part of your question, what does it mean and what does it potentially mean to agriculture? It appears to me we are more and more comfortable picking winners and losers and sort of being binary in saying, you're right and this other side is completely wrong and there is no nuance and this is just the answer. And so you're either in or out. To me, that seems, and I don't want to sound mealy mouthed. I mean, there are some things that are black and white. There are some things that are binary, but, public health as a general classification of conversation, it has a lot of moving parts, has a lot of components. And so my fear is that there'll be some swift reactions and maybe even the risk of the implementation of some quick policies that actually end up hurting companies and agribusiness and at the end of the day, farmers without actually improving public health. Great little story that involves a North Carolina company. They use one of the dyes in their food processing that has become one of the focus dyes that's going to be taken off the market or not allowed in food products in the United States. There's this volley of congratulations and sort of self-congratulatory press conferences that this is happening. We're getting this dye out of our food. Unfortunately, there's never been a study that says that dye actually creates any health problems. And yet now we're driven to make that decision. What does that mean on the ground? Well, it means a company that I'm familiar with is going to have to change their manufacturing processes. There's 200 jobs at risk there. They buy a good amount of North Carolina grown products and then process them into an end product. And they've got to completely change their mechanism and their methodology and what they put in the product. And they have a specific consumer base that is going to be impacted by this potentially. And so I guess I would just say, like any major movement, my fear is that very good intentions,
Right.
very much a different conversation to talk about good outcomes. And I think as broad as the tent is, we touched on that earlier, if you try to be all things to all people without prioritizing, then you get spread pretty thin. And then I think that's when you're at risk of having unmeaningful sort of motion, not mission related outcomes.
Right.
So cut me off, Jenny. I know I have a tendency to ramble about this.
Absolutely. I mean, it's fairly obvious if the accomplishments stop at food dyes, you're not going to address public health, whatever the issues with that might be. And I'd say with my own kids, it sure is easier to get them to eat something that's neon colored than natural colored.
It's just sort of
I've tried, but it's not simple.
No, that's right. That's hilarious that you say that. And admittedly, we don't need these things, right? I mean, do I need another piece of candy that glows? No. But is that the true north, or is the true north? Does this present the risk of a deleterious health consequence? on a person. And, my sense is that the things we're tinkering with at the moment that will cause some pain in the food manufacturing space, we've not really necessarily found the exact true north that this group claims to be trying to find. I'll throw another thing out that's a little that I think is worth considering, and that is one of the realizations that I made working in public policy and working with ag groups versus working with food manufacturers. And sometimes those are the same, right? I mean, sometimes those are very closely intertwined. But for most of us, we take our product to a market, we sell it in. Somebody else does the food manufacturing, the marketing, it works with the retailer to get it on the shelf, et cetera. We've always been frustrated, I think, in agriculture that the food companies don't or haven't taken up some of our fight, right? Like back during GMO days when we were trying to make it clear that there wouldn't be any consequence of using GMOs in food products, or trying to figure out the labeling legislation, which is now, I think, pretty settled 10 years later. And even the public's perception of GMOs and acceptance of them is obviously much better than it was a decade ago. But I remember in ag, we were always frustrated that the food companies didn't really help us much in this conversation with the public. And I was always offended by that, right? And I tell in my book the story of us having a meeting with Secretary Perdue in the first Trump administration, and we brought in a representative of the food manufacturers, and we were going to really let him hold it, right? We were really going to tell him, y'all got to get in this conversation a little more. You got to tell your customers what's right and wrong about GMOs. And basically his response to that was, no, we don't. And I remember first being offended by that, right? Like I'm like, who do you think you are? You're talking to a cabinet member right here, but what I learned in that interaction is, food companies don't have time to fight with their customers. That typically does not end up well. And so while we in the farming community are like, hey, tell the truth about GMOs, and why are you putting a label that says GMO free? I think the food companies would say back to us, well, we're putting that because our research shows that that's going to help us move more product or reach our core constituency in terms of the marketplace. I had to learn to not be offended by that, but to just understand where they are in the market is very different, I think, than where farmers are. And they don't have time to argue with their customer, because if they do, somebody else, somewhere else on that shelf is going to say to that consumer exactly what the consumer wants to hear. And so it's been interesting. All that to say, I think it's interesting to watch in the MAHA conversations. A lot of the food companies have simply said, we're not going to be really loud about this. We're not going to get in that process and make a big stir. We're going to do what we need to do to keep these customers and to keep this movement sort of happy or at bay. And I think it's important for farmers and Aggies to understand that we're really at different places in the marketplace, and it's a little bit unfair to expect the food companies to take up some of our fights, because they're literally not in the education of their consumers business. They are in the move product into that consumer shopping cart business. And again, early, I was mad
margin
about
business,
that.
right?
Yeah, that's right. And I've been angry about that at times, right, in the years past. And I think I'm a little more pragmatic about it now. I just understand, they're at a different place. They don't want to argue with their customer.
Well, I mean, in that sense, this sort of dialogue, if you want to have it, that's probably the nice way of saying it, about agriculture and public health could be really healthy in the long.
It can. I think the missing piece for agriculture, and I don't have the answer to it, Jenny, but I think the missing piece is we have not articulated yet exactly where the farmer ought to be in that conversation, right? Like, we don't know. We are not the ultimate processor that turns the product into that consumer-facing good in most cases. I mean, certainly in grains, we are not, right? Like, I mean, in fresh fruits and vegetables, of course, the product comes out of our field with some minimal processing, washing. I mean, maybe lots of processing if you're turning it into a dip or a salsa or putting it in an input in another food product. So fruits and vegetables perhaps a little bit different, but I think, our large acreage crops in the United States, the farmer in that space, the corn grower, the wheat grower, the soybean grower, does not really, I think, know, okay, what is my role in the food as health movement? I don't know what the answer to that is. I'd love to sort of work on figuring that out. I mean, we'd love to have conversations with people about how to find that. But at the moment, I think that's what scares me the most is we're not really sure what our safe place is in this conversation. And on the other hand, we'll grow what the market wants, right? I mean, if that buyer is coming in and saying, hey, I want it grown this way, farmers, assuming there's a profit margin there, which is a big assumption,
Absolutely.
but farmers will do it,
Easiest.
right? Like if the market speaks, farmers will react. And so I don't know
Absolutely.
what your perspective is on that sort of in the academic space and at the university level, but I don't feel like we've found the right place for farmers at the moment and in the movement, other than a few folks taking advantage of it and saying, hey, buy your stuff from me. I don't do those things. And I get
Yeah.
that. That's the market. Again, that's the market
Yeah.
working.
Absolutely.
But, I also know the way we feed 330 million people a day, 3 meals a day, is not by those families ordering all of that food in a box to be shipped to them, off a farm that grows things a certain way. I don't have anything against those folks. I think getting those
Yeah.
niches in the market is great. And some of them aren't niches; they're bigger than that. So I don't mean that term as an
Right.
insult. But
Right.
other than just creating some small market share for some folks that are entrepreneurial enough to take it, I don't think we know yet what the farmer role is in the movement.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's kind of what we're figuring out now. And one I guess to switch gears a little bit, one of the things I did want to talk with you is how we think MAHA might approach sort of standard farm policies, the safety net, conservation, regulation of pesticides, and we're starting to see a little bit of this now. Is there one of those you'd like to tackle first, or you're comfortable with?
Yeah, well, I think if you'd asked me that question a year ago, I'd have been very comfortable saying this is something we ought to watch and be careful about. But for the most part, on Capitol Hill, where the jurisdiction of those programs and directives and statutes sit, there's not a lot of risk to the American farmer. That the American farmer is still, notwithstanding the diminution in numbers of people that come off farms and go into public service, ag is still pretty darn well represented on the Hill. Probably in terms of its percentage of the population, it's probably a little overrepresented in Congress. Second to that, I would say, particularly in D.C. and frankly in our state capitals as well, those people that represent agriculture are very connected. They are very tied in. So your
Better be.
commodity associations across the country are close to the members and support them, and are in their offices doing what we expect and frankly pay them to do. But so that's kind of the Hill. That's my take on the
Right.
Hill. We're in pretty good shape there. But what's unique about this administration is just how aggressively they are using the administrative branch, the executive branch of government, to force change. And I think if you look closely at some of the things that's come out of DHHS, there have been some formal rulemaking proposals, things that comply with the Administrative Procedures Act at the federal level. But a lot of what they've done is executive order pronouncements and then reaching agreements with food companies that say, "Hey, we'll do this if you think." I think it's fair to say we'll do this if you'll leave us alone. Otherwise,
Yeah.
those things are obviously less durable because a future administration could change them. But I think that was a risk again. If you're thinking about a conservative government, you would not think about a conservative government maximizing the administrative function of the government, right? Like letting the executive do these things relatively unfettered. And we're going to make a lot of case law over the course of the next 4 years, but it appears that even the courts, particularly in a post Chevron world, are going to be pretty deferential to letting the executive branch do what it wants to do here. And so to me, that's a seismic shift and something we've got to be careful about. So to recap, 10 years ago, I wasn't that worried about ag's fate on the Hill. Today, it's a harder question. What is ag's fate in an administration that's acting relatively unilaterally? And I mean, that's the way administration does work. So again, that's not a dirty word.
Right, right.
Work without necessarily aligning with new directives that's been delivered to it by Congress. So that's something to watch, I think, is just how much power does DHHS have in the food space, USDA, and some of the meat and poultry space to actually change the way we're raising, selling, processing, and ultimately delivering food crops to American consumers.
Yeah, and it seems like the approach with, I think, HHS and the Department of Agriculture has largely been cooperative. The high level messages we're getting out of the latest MAHA report seem to reflect this deferring to the EPA on pesticides. Looks like a pretty traditional view on conservation programs as well.
Yeah, and I think part of that is a result of the ag communities getting in the room. I think early on there was concern that they would not be listened to. We saw immediately after the report came out this week, a number of agricultural groups praised the administration for getting them in and kind of giving them a seat at the table. On the flip side, there's criticism that watered it down, that the report ultimately didn't move the needle enough, et cetera. But yeah, I think there's alignment there. I mean, it's just you'd be sort of foolish to posit that this is something that they're not going to get across the finish line. In other words, and RFK is obviously a big part of that. The idea that this is something that he views as super important, and he has a super long leash in this administration, and so this is not going away. And I think that collaboration is probably good in that regard, because it seems like it's going to come up over and over again. And ag does feel more comfortable with our leadership at USDA than we do at other agencies. And so, but that's part of the process. I mean, on any issue, that alignment. If you're going to build a durable project, there are lots of things that have to be coordinated across the entire government, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think from a policy continuity perspective is that you couldn't talk about climate, then everything had to be climate smart. But now we can say soil health and regenerative. But
Yeah.
if you look at what you actually do, how it seems like they're finding some kind of consensus.
Yeah, and that seems like progress, right, Jenny? Like that to sort of initially hear we're going to ban pesticides, and now to hear, we're gonna hold EPA to its own standards, and by the way, those standards are the gold standard, better than any regulatory agency in the world. To me, that does sound like progress. I mean, that's better than where this thing started.
What I'm seeing here in Kansas is that pesticides, I mean, there's a lot of issues with resistance. Pesticides are very expensive. So this is a serious farm management issue. It's not necessarily the regular. I mean, high farm expenses are a general farm management issue. Across the board. I mean, regulations could sort of work in both ways, making it difficult to access what you need.
Yep.
Need or not. So.
Yeah, I talk to a good amount of chemical companies. I spend time with trade associations that work in that space, and what I see them investing in trying to find the next generation of what will be delivered to our fields is completely remarkable. Just incredible in terms of how hard they're working to find the next thing. Feels like maybe it's a little harder from the outside looking in than it has been, that we're still sort of awaiting breakthroughs on certain things. But with that said, the thing that worries me the most, and I think this is right in line with what you want to talk about on this podcast that I'm thrilled you've got going. I mean, I think this is very smart that you're doing this to reach more people. As a quick aside, a lot of the educational programs for farmers that require a farmer to come in for a day or come in for a weekend, we're learning those are not going to work, because they're looking at their phones multiple times every day. Why not put it on there? Why not let them play it in the cab of that tractor or in that combine? So I compliment you for what you're doing here. But to me, the biggest fear in the pesticide development and deployment space is what I hear companies saying is our regulatory process is so challenging that I'm going to take this product to one of our competitors and deploy it in their field, and they'll get the advantage of this technology before the U.S. grower does. And so notice I've teed up attention, because 3 minutes ago, I said EPA is our gold standard. We're the best in the world. And now I'm complaining because it's hard to get through that process, and that technology appears to go to farmers outside the U.S. first, even if it was our innovation that helped to basically create it. So, I feel like we've got to find that balance. I mean, that's a little bit of a cop out, the third way that makes everybody happy. But a lot of that is just around speed and competence at the federal government level. And I was worried, just as a classical conservative, that we have shifted the conversation away from the size of government. Nobody really talks about that, complains about that as much anymore.
Yeah.
And what I'd love to see is more of a conversation around the competence of government. And so I think the chemical companies would tell you, those that are developing these new pesticides, there's really some brilliant people inside of our federal government working in these agencies, and they're very public, minded, not paid
Sure.
like their counterparts are in the private sector. So it's impressive what they do for a living. But frankly, two things need to happen. They probably need more help. And number two, they've got to be held to standards that deliver more quickly. And if they're, if you can't just throw money at that problem, there may be other creative ways to get us there. So I ramble, as you now know, Jenny, but in terms of the pesticide stuff, I think the real win in the MAHA report is just, supporting EPA, not making that process any more treacherous than it already is or difficult, while at the same time making sure we can uphold those gold standards that we're known for around the world.
Yeah, no, I think making the parts of government that have some consensus more effective is
Yeah.
that's
It
a
feels
real
like that ought to
challenge,
be
and you
bipartisan,
see it
right?
here.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think sometimes we can root for government to be ineffective if they're doing things we don't like.
yeah,
But in this space, I think everybody agrees. Yeah, it's great to have a regulatory agency that tests the efficacy and the safety of these products before they go to market. But it's got to do that in a way that's advantageous ultimately to the American farmer, which means ultimately to the American consumer, so that we get this technology and other people don't.
I mean, I talk about, I guess, with pesticides, you need that speed of innovation. This is a challenge from the beginning of agriculture, right? And we've just
That's right.
constantly been innovating, trying to stay ahead. So yeah, I completely understand that.
Yeah, and the big picture risk, Jenny, is that people decide not just to deploy that technology somewhere else, meaning our farmers don't get it, but eventually decide not to develop it here. I mean, I think we have the talent supply that makes us the best place to deploy it still, or to come up with it, to develop it. But anyway, big picture fears there, and hopefully we've struck the balance and are not going to make that situation any worse based on the MAHA.
Right. And we switched to conservation policy. I mean, the USDA has always got to mostly have the carrot on that side of conservation and the environment. You have very popular working lands programs, EQIP, CSP. I'm going to forget one of these acronyms. It's hard teaching policy.
Don't ask me to describe all the different programs and all their moving parts.
They keep making new ones. You want to talk about safety net
And
policies or?
I can comment on the conservation piece just quickly.
Okay.
I mean, I think what we've always liked about those programs is that they have relatively universal support. When we talk about conservation, when we talk about sustainability and sort of environmental stewardship, typically you can align people on any side of the aisle to understand. Yeah, that sounds important to me. I don't know, the devil's in the details, right? But that sounds important to me. I think the risk or the concern around how we deploy those dollars is how difficult it is for the agency to actually get them out in the field, because you have in NRCS, you literally have employees that have to agree or bless how the dollars are going to be deployed. And then, of course, there's got to be some policing of that. If you've agreed to implement certain practices, if you've agreed to pull certain land and use it a certain way, then yeah, I mean, we've got to have some enforcement of that. And I think there is a concern that the technical expertise in the agency to do that is probably always a challenge, because, again, you've got to really find public servant-minded people that are willing to do that work and probably do it at slightly below market rate. And so that's what I hear when I talk to farmers and folks that are trying to take advantage of those programs is, look, the idea is good, but I don't have 2 years to tinker with sending plans back and forth to an employee and, frankly, teaching them what we do on the farm. So I hope USDA, and I think they do, sort of hear those concerns and will work to address them. But we need efficiency in the management of that program, not just the dollars and the direction itself, if that makes sense.
Getting back to what we talked about with the EPA and pesticides, that
yeah, that's exactly right.
Not new problems with delivering conservation programs, having some flexibility and accountability under labor shortages, which is,
That's
again,
exactly
not.
Right. Yeah. Some of which arguably
new.
could be self-induced, right? I mean, it's not clear what DOGE ultimately did. To me, at least, it's not clear what that ultimately did to numbers out in the field, whether some of those positions ultimately be rehired, people be brought back, or new people would be brought into the agency. That sort of brings up a thing that I think is interesting to watch at USDA, and that is this notion that they're going to continue to move people out of their DC footprint and out into the field. I think as a general matter, that causes me absolutely zero weeping and gnashing of teeth. I mean, the idea that we need fewer people driving around on the roads in Washington, D.C., as a person who lived there for 4.5 years, I love that idea, right? Like, if it is not essential for you to be there, for your own sanity, I would highly recommend you get out. And so, maybe that helps with some of these challenges of delivering programs in the field. When folks are sitting at the softball game, down the bleacher from the farmer, or when their kids are both involved in the same FFA program, to me that seems net positive.
Well, I mean, I grew up in an agricultural community in Illinois. My family farmed in Kansas. I'm out here, and I think that the local USDA employees, the Soil and Water Conservation, NRCS, they're just any stereotype you have about government employees, that was the opposite, right? They're
Yeah,
members of your
yeah.
local community. You worked with them. So, I mean, in that sense, I think one of the concerns with the and that's not what we're here to talk about, is that you could potentially lose some expertise, and they're probably going to have to figure out what that looks like.
Yep, I definitely can't disagree with that, and suspect that will slow down some program delivery, no doubt.
Yeah. All right. And it looks like they don't really touch much on sort of farm safety net policies, crop insurance, the Title I, ARC and PLC farm bill programs. We've had a lot of ad hoc disaster programs, and I really don't see too much,
Look, I think
from.
coming out of the BPP, whatever you want to call it, the big beautiful bill,
Yeah.
we're in a much better position than we were. I mean, those reference price adjustments are clearly a big deal. Some things that on crop insurance are clearly going to be helpful for people. The one thing out there to keep your eye on is, I believe, this goes to some of the stuff I talk about when I'm out on some cultural conversation around agriculture, which we've not talked much about here, but I think it's super important. I really do continue to be concerned that the same notion of picking winners and losers and not letting the market sort of dictate outcomes, as we talked about with MAHA, I'm worried that creeps more and more and more into farm policy, and the notion that there are good farms and bad farms, good crops and bad crops. I mean, take the food SNAP program, because people think I'm crazy when I say this, but it'll be interesting 10 years from now where we are. It appears out in public that there is wide public support for eliminating some products or taking some products out of SNAP eligibility. And we see things like, hey, if you're going to eat a high calorie candy bar or fried chips, or super sugary soft drinks, let's take those out of the program, right? So, and I'm not saying necessarily that's my position, because again, everybody's in different places. I don't want to alienate anybody here, but I guess I would say, how far is that from, hey, what's one of the highest sort of fat content meats we can think of? Bacon, right? I love bacon. I actually am a part of a company that sells a lot of bacon. I think bacon is super important for American happiness and global peace. But I could see a group of health experts saying, we're going to create a list of good meats and bad meats, and bacon's not going to make the good list. And so I just worry about slippery slope, winners and choosers. I think that's going to be a risk that's not just in the food space, but that could potentially move over into participation in farm programs, ad hoc disaster, or whatever.
I mean, I think I am very concerned about, as sort of, from my sort of researcher hat maybe, but I'm concerned about policy stability.
Yeah.
Now that we have, and we've used more executive powers, maybe this administration is doing it more. It's not new. And then you just get this, you get more unpredictability. Policy,
That's right.
changes
Which
every
makes
4
it harder and
years.
harder to plan. I mean, I think that's where our farmers are. I'm actually working with a large group of farm credit folks next week, and probably the biggest concern they have is just the inability to have any certainty. So farming's never been certain, right? But when we're looking at the trade situation, the sort of global dynamic that we're in at the moment, when we're looking at farm programs and their administration, am I actually going to get to take advantage of it? It feels like the chair of the Richmond Federal Reserve Board said a couple of weeks ago, the business community is driving in fog, and you just can't go but so fast if you're driving in fog, or you're not going to see far enough in front of you to be able to do that. And so, I love that notion of the lack of policy stability, and that's the real hurt here, is that we don't even know what the policy is going to be next year, much less fully fully in this year.
Absolutely. Anything else about sort of, I guess we went on a few tangents here, but I think they're important ones. Anything else about, how MAHA approaches government in general, or, what you're seeing what you're going to be looking at over the next several months?
Yeah, well, I want to add one other thing about the MAHA thing. I think in any national movement or perceived national movement, you will see the presentation and potential adoption of ideas, not just on Capitol Hill, but in state capitals as well. And so we've already seen a number of initiatives at the state level in a number of states where we sort of mini MAHA movements. Again, I think the ag community's best bet is to be at that table, make sure your interests are represented, and point to the facts and the truth and demand an explanation for why lawmakers think it is that this particular move will actually improve health outcomes, because it's going to present cost to you ultimately. And we want to make sure if you're bearing those costs, A, that you can pass them along, but B, certainly that they actually are worthwhile. And so that's the thing I would watch as well, is just how the movement pops up in state capitals. It was 15 years ago, we were all angry that somebody wanted to tax soda pop in New York City. We thought that was just crazy nutty. And now we've got Republican legislatures, introducing bills that target, very similar foods. So it's what a time to be alive is what I like to say, Jenny. We're just culturally in the food and ag space. There's no shortage of things to talk about. It's a heck of a time.
Absolutely. And like you said, it's going to play out Capitol Hill in DC. It's going to play out in the state capitals. Food manufacturers are going to have to figure it out. It's certainly playing out in social media, in conversations people are having. So I think, we can come back to this in 6 months and a year and see how surprised we are or not.
Yeah, and maybe one other thing I would say that I think is important is the cast of characters is much more broad than what we've traditionally realized. Working at a statewide chamber, one of the fun things I get to do is work with companies that are outside of the ag space. Take, for instance, our largest statewide insurer, Blue Cross and Blue Shield. They're super interested in the food as health movement, right? They are, for good reason. Right? Like it's about hoping that they won't have to increase health insurance premiums, if they can get better health outcomes from their plan members. And so we got to figure out how to link arms with those folks, how to work together, not just, see those people as, they're external to the ag environment. The ag environment is pretty darn big these days. And we got some new players we got to take advantage of.
Yeah, here in Kansas, other states are starting to have conversations about food as health, and I think specifically produce prescriptions and what those look like for.
Yeah. So our that's funny because our that's exactly something they've experimented with and are tweaking and frankly getting better and better at, and makes sense to me. Well, Jenny, we've covered a lot of ground. Again, let me just say, while we're on the record, great respect for folks in Kansas, great respect for K-State. You stole our old College of Ag and Life dean, Dean Linton. I knew very well here at NC State. He is a very energetic and just super, super human being. I wish you all much success in what you're doing there, and, salt of the earth. I hope I get invited to come back to Kansas. Just such a beautiful place to me, and just absolutely salt of the earth people. So I know you're enjoying your appointment in the college, and it's a pleasure to hang out with you and talk to you a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to continue this conversation. A lot of changes happening. All right.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Smoke and Mirrors. If today made you think or see things a little differently, share it with someone who appreciates cutting through the noise. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for spending part of the day with us. Until next time, keep asking what